A scream echoes through the night as the train races toward doom. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Avella. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments mean the world to me. Let's unravel this mystery together. Now, let's begin. The afternoon sunlight slanted across the cobbled street of St. Mary Mead, turning the neat hedgerows into walls of soft gold. From the church spire came the faint chime of 4 o'clock, blending harmoniously with the distant hum of bees and the occasional bark of a restless dog. It was a picture of peace, the sort of timeless English serenity that tourists adored, and that Miss Jane Marple, seated in her garden with a tray of tea and seed cake, regarded with mild amusement. "Too quiet," she murmured, refilling her cup. And quiet, in my experience, is often the prelude to something quite dreadful. She was not given to melodrama, but Miss Marple, whose pale blue eyes saw everything and missed nothing, had lived long enough to know that evil rarely entered villages in dramatic fashion. It crept in quietly, like fog or gossip. At that very moment, the peace of the village was already being disturbed, though no one yet knew it. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, Miss Marple's oldest friend, was hosting her annual garden club tea at Gossington Hall. A parade of cucumber sandwiches, seed packets and social rivalries was well underway. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had taken charge of the raffle with alarming efficiency, while Colonel Melchett, retired but still puffed with authority, grumbled about these infernal hybrid roses to anyone within earshot. It was an event much like any other in St. Mary Mead, until the sound of a train whistle floated through the air. Not unusual, perhaps, except that it was a midnight train, and it was only 4 in the afternoon. "Strange," muttered Mr. Pritchard, the station-master's brother, glancing toward the direction of the line. "There's no express due until the morning." No one thought much of it, not until the next morning, when word came that the London to Exeter Express had made an unscheduled stop near the village during the night. A passenger had been found dead in one of the sleeping compartments. By breakfast time, the news had spread like ivy. At the post office, Miss Hartnell declared she always said something wicked would happen, what with all those strangers renting cottages lately. Mrs. Price Ridley, for her part, was sure it must be a case of suicide. People do dreadful things when they've lost all moral fibre. Miss Marple, pouring her morning tea, listened to these theories with a faint smile. The newspapers reported that the victim, a middle-aged man travelling alone, had been struck on the back of the head. No weapon was found. No witnesses had seen anything suspicious. To most, it was a puzzling tragedy. To Miss Marple, it was human nature in motion. That afternoon, a small commotion stirred the high street as a black motor car drew up outside the police station. Out stepped Inspector Craddock, the very same who had once worked alongside Miss Marple during the case of the blue geranium. His expression was grim but respectful when he called upon her at her ivy-clad cottage later that day. "Another murder, Miss Marple," he said with a sigh. "A man found dead on the midnight train. Name of Mr. Edward Latham. Businessman, unmarried, and, well, quite without enemies, it seems." "People rarely are, Inspector," said Miss Marple softly. "They simply have enemies no one knows about." Craddock chuckled. "If I recall correctly, that sort of thinking once helped us unmask a killer. Perhaps you'll lend a hand again." "Oh, my dear Inspector," said Miss Marple, her eyes twinkling, "I never lend a hand. I merely observe. And people are always so obliging as to show one exactly what one needs to see." That evening, As twilight fell over the village, the faint echo of a train whistle drifted again from the distance. Long, low, and melancholy, Miss Marple, gazing from her window, watched the lights of the express snake through the darkening countryside like a silver thread. Somewhere aboard, she thought, lay the first clue to a very human story, one written, as always, in deceit, pride, and a touch of fear. "People," she murmured, "are rather like trains. You never quite know where they'll stop, or whom they'll take with them." Would you like me to continue with Section 2? The village reacts, where gossip and suspicion begin to spread through St. Mary Mead, introducing the key suspects. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead was in an uproar. Not a loud or chaotic uproar, of course. The village prided itself on its sense of decorum, but the sort of subdued, simmering commotion that brewed over cups of tea and whispered remarks in the greengrocer's queue. The murder on the midnight train had given everyone a story to tell, and as Miss Marple well knew, stories in St. Mary Mead grew more elaborate with every retelling. At the post office, Miss Hartnell was quite certain that she had seen the deceased only 2 days before, buying a packet of Players' cigarettes and behaving rather queerly. Mrs. Price Ridley dismissed this, insisting that she had heard from her niece in Exeter that the man was an insurance broker of impeccable reputation. Miss Weatherby, who prided herself on discretion, merely sipped her tea and murmured that one never knew what went on behind a gentleman's polished exterior. Miss Marple listened to all this quietly from her usual seat near the lace-curtained window of the post office, pretending to be occupied with the latest delivery of stamps. Her eyes, however, flicked up every so often, studying the villagers with that mild, bird-like curiosity of hers. People, she reflected, always revealed far more than they intended when they thought themselves merely gossiping. That evening a knock came at her door. It was Inspector Craddock again, his hat in hand, looking both weary and perplexed. "We've learned a little more, Miss Marple," he said, accepting the cup of tea she offered without needing to be asked. The deceased, Mr. Edward Latham, had taken the midnight train from London bound for Exeter. He was alone in his compartment when the train stopped unexpectedly near St. Mary Mead due to a signal failure. When it resumed, he was found dead before the next station. Blunt force trauma. No sign of robbery. Nothing missing except, oddly enough, his ticket. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "His ticket? That is interesting. You think so?" Craddock looked surprised. "I do. People rarely think to remove something so insignificant as a ticket unless it is meant to conceal a particular detail. Perhaps where he boarded, or where he intended to disembark." "We checked," Craddock said. "He boarded at Paddington. The guard confirmed it." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "Ah, but perhaps he wanted people to believe he boarded at Paddington." Craddock frowned. "You mean he might have joined the train later? It wouldn't be the first time someone boarded at an earlier stop and wished to disguise it," she said mildly. "A very simple deception, Inspector, but an effective one if the victim had some reason for secrecy." "You think he was hiding? Don't you?" she asked, her tone almost playful. A man travelling alone, late at night, with no luggage except a briefcase, found dead without witnesses, and a missing ticket. It sounds less like a man on business, and more like someone, slipping away from something. Craddock looked unconvinced, though he scribbled a note in his small black book. "We've taken statements from the other passengers. There was a woman, Mrs. Elspeth Northcote, returning to Exeter after visiting her sister in London. She claims to have heard footsteps outside her compartment shortly after the stop. No voices, just one person walking briskly past. And was she alone? Yes, her compartment was empty." "Footsteps," murmured Miss Marple, her gaze drifting toward the window where dusk was gathering. People rarely take note of footsteps, Inspector, yet they tell so much about a person. Their purpose, their confidence, even their conscience. She smiled faintly, as though remembering something from long ago. In my youth, I once heard a young man walking away from a scene of mischief. He tried to appear calm, but the rhythm of his steps betrayed him. Too deliberate, too measured. I expect this was something like that, Craddock sighed. You always make it sound so simple. Human nature usually is, said Miss Marple, with a small shrug. We're all creatures of habit, after all. Only in times of guilt do we change our patterns. The next morning brought another ripple of excitement to the village when it was learned that a stranger had been seen near the old footbridge not far from the railway line. Mrs. Bantry's gardener claimed he spotted the man around midnight, wearing a dark overcoat and hat, the sort of fellow you'd notice because he didn't seem to want to be noticed. Naturally, this detail spread faster than any official police announcement. The stranger, it seemed, had been seen walking away from the train line in the direction of St. Mary Mead itself. Miss Marple, upon hearing this from Mrs. Bantry over breakfast, merely nodded. People who wish not to be noticed seldom succeed, Dolly. They always overdo it, too careful by half. It's rather like pretending to be asleep. One always looks just a little too still. Mrs. Bantry chuckled nervously. Jane, you make it sound as though the man must be the murderer. Oh, my dear, not necessarily, Miss Marple said, folding her napkin neatly. But it does suggest he may have known more than he wished to confess. Well, I do hope Inspector Craddock finds him soon, Mrs. Bantry said. There's something horrid about knowing a killer might be lurking so close. Miss Marple smiled gently. I doubt our murderer will linger, Dolly. Murderers are rather like migratory birds. They seldom stay once the chill of suspicion sets in. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet walk toward the station, her pace unhurried, her eyes attentive. She paused at the signal box, exchanging polite conversation with young Tom Weaver, the signalman's apprentice. He was a bright lad, eager to please, and happy to recount every detail of the previous night's disruption. The express stopped right before the bridge, ma'am, he said eagerly. Fault in the signal wiring. Only for 10 minutes or so, but I swear I saw someone get off the train. Just a shadow, mind. Couldn't tell man or woman. But there was movement. And you're quite sure it came from the express? Yes, ma'am. The light from the carriage windows caught them as they stepped down. Miss Marple thanked him kindly and continued on her way, her thoughts quietly knitting together. A missing ticket, footsteps outside a compartment, and now a shadow stepping off the train. It was beginning to form a pattern, one that spoke not of impulse or chance, but of careful design. By the time she returned home, the first rain of evening had begun to fall, soft and steady. She settled by the fire, her knitting in her lap, though her needles remained motionless. Outside, the wind carried the distant echo of another passing train. Miss Marple lifted her head slightly, her expression serene but thoughtful. Somewhere between London and St. Mary Mead, she suspected lay the truth, and as always, it would be hidden not in alibis or evidence, but in the quiet inconsistencies of human behaviour. The next morning dawned grey and misty, a thin veil of fog curling through the narrow lanes of St. Mary Mead like a cat slinking between hedgerows. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and drew aside her lace curtains. The village, subdued under its blanket of mist, looked almost unreal. Church spire half hidden, the roofs of cottages glistening faintly with dew. It was, she thought, the kind of morning when secrets preferred to stay buried. Yet the world, despite its quiet, had a peculiar way of bringing them to light. At precisely 9 o'clock, there came another knock on her door, firmer this time, hurried. It was Inspector Craddock again, his expression tight with the strain of a man whose investigation was yielding more confusion than clarity. Miss Marple ushered him in without ceremony, offering tea and scones as though they were about to discuss parish matters instead of murder. "I've had a report, Miss Marple," he said, sitting forward, hat balanced on his knee. "That stranger, the one Mrs. Bantry's gardener saw near the footbridge, he's been found, staying at the Rose and Crown, under the name of Mr. Henry Vale. Claims he came down from London yesterday for a bit of walking. Says he knows nothing about the train business, but I'm not convinced." "And what makes you doubtful, Inspector?" "For one thing, he was rather evasive about his movements. For another, he seemed to know far too much about the murder for a man who claims to have read only the morning paper." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Oh, people do love to appear better informed than they are, Inspector. Particularly men of a certain temperament, those who fear seeming ignorant." "True," Craddock admitted, "but Vale gave a peculiar detail no paper printed. He said the victim's compartment had one window stuck open." "That's correct, but we never released it publicly." Miss Marple's eyes lifted slightly. "That is interesting. Did he explain how he knew?" "He said he overheard it from a porter at Paddington, which might be possible, but the porter denies speaking to anyone about it." "Then, my dear Inspector," said Miss Marple gently, "you have two possibilities. Either Mr. Vale was on that train himself, or he's spoken to someone who was." Craddock exhaled, a slow, frustrated breath. He's not an easy one to pin down. Polite, educated, well-spoken. But there's something slippery about him. He's the sort who measures every word, as though thinking 3 sentences ahead. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, the calculating type. I've met quite a few at the Women's Institute, always arranging flowers and politics at the same time." "Do you think he's our man?" Craddock asked. "Not necessarily," she said, pouring him another cup of tea. "But he's certainly connected. The question is how." That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to the Rose and Crown under the most innocent of pretexts: to return a library book accidentally given to the wrong lodger. A harmless errand, one that no one would question from the village's sweet-tempered spinster. The inn was warm and dimly lit, the scent of wood smoke mingling with that of damp wool. Behind the counter stood Mr. Hill, the innkeeper, wiping glasses and humming tunelessly. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said cheerfully. "Lovely morning, if you like your air thick enough to drink." "Quite so, Mr. Hill," she replied pleasantly. "I was just returning this book to one of your guests, Mr. Vale, I believe." "Oh, he's upstairs," Mr. Hill said. "Quiet fellow, keeps to himself. Writes a bit, he says, notes and letters and what not. Doesn't look the writing sort to me, though." "And what sort does he look like?" Miss Marple asked mildly, her eyes twinkling. "The sort who's used to being watched but pretends not to notice," Mr. Hill said after a pause. "Strange thing to say, I know, but he's got that air about him." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "It often takes one kind of observer to recognize another." She thanked him and ascended the narrow staircase, her footsteps light and deliberate. As she passed the first landing, she caught the faint murmur of a voice. Mr. Vale's, unmistakably cultured, speaking on the telephone in a tone that suggested urgency rather than panic. "I told you it wasn't safe. Yes, she's here. No, not her, another one. No, of course I won't. Listen, if they find out about the case, it will ruin everything." There was a pause, followed by a click. Miss Marple, having heard quite enough, continued down the corridor with the serene pace of a woman for whom curiosity was a hobby. not a vice. She knocked lightly on the door. "Come in," came the voice, composed again, smooth. Mr. Vale was of medium height, dark-haired, with a well-cut suit that spoke of taste, but not extravagance. His eyes were the sort that missed little. Alert, intelligent, and faintly guarded. He rose with a faint smile. "Ah, good morning, madam. How may I assist you?" "Forgive the intrusion," Miss Marple said, holding out the small book. "The library mixed up its records again. I believe this was mistakenly added to your name. Oh, let me see." He took the book, glanced at it, a copy of the Pilgrim's Progress, and smiled faintly. "Ah, a moral tale. I suppose we could all use a bit of that these days." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "I find stories of journeys rather comforting. So many unexpected turns, so many fellow travellers. And yet one never quite knows which companions will endure to the end." "True enough," he replied, his smile tightening slightly. "You've a poet's way of putting things, Miss Marple," she said. "Jane Marple." "Ah," he said softly, as though the name carried some recognition. "I believe I've heard of you." "Most unlikely," she said with modest amusement. "I'm known chiefly for my garden and my rather plain sponge cake." "And yet," said Vale, "I think there's more to you than that." Miss Marple merely smiled, inclining her head. "As there so often is with people, Mr. Vale. Good day to you." She left the room with the same unhurried grace, though her mind was already turning. The tone of that telephone conversation, the tension in his voice, the unspoken familiarity with something not safe. These were not the marks of a man concerned with leisure. She had the distinct impression that Mr. Henry Vale was entangled in something quite beyond the scope of an innocent countryside ramble. Later that evening, Inspector Craddock returned to see her again, rain glistening on his overcoat. "You were right," he said, setting his hat down. "We checked Vale's story. There's no record of him taking a train from London yesterday, or any reservation under that name at all. He's using an alias." "How intriguing," Miss Marple murmured, "and yet hardly surprising. People who wish to remain unnoticed often select names that sound dull rather than mysterious. Henry Vale has a faintly respectable ring to it, don't you think?" "Respectable enough to pass casual scrutiny," Craddock agreed. "But there's more. We traced a letter found in the victim's pocket. A single sheet, unsigned, but with a postmark from London. It reads, 'Meet me on the midnight train. Bring the documents, and come alone.'" Miss Marple's eyes brightened just slightly. "Ah, now that is telling. A meeting arranged under secrecy, a missing ticket, and a man who pretends to be something he isn't. I should say, Inspector, your Mr. Latham was not travelling for business at all." "Then for what?" "Possibly blackmail," Miss Marple said softly. "Or perhaps he was the blackmailer himself." She looked thoughtfully toward the fire, the shadows flickering across her face. There is always, in such matters, one person who profits not by the crime itself, but by what it silences. The clock struck 8, the sound clear and resonant in the quiet room. Outside the fog thickened again, swallowing the world in a damp, opaque hush. Miss Marple set down her knitting, her gaze distant yet precise. "You'll find, Inspector," she said, "that Mr. Vale isn't the only person in St. Mary Mead who took an interest in that midnight train. Sometimes the most extraordinary events begin with the simplest of connections. Someone's gardener, someone's maid, someone's idle curiosity." "You think the village is involved?" Craddock asked. Miss Marple gave her small, knowing smile. "My dear Inspector, in St. Mary Mead everyone is involved. They simply haven't realized it yet." The following day brought a restless energy to St. Mary Mead. The fog had lifted, but the unease that lingered in its wake felt heavier than the mist itself. The villagers went about their daily routines with exaggerated purpose, as though by keeping busy they might shield themselves from the dreadful awareness that a murderer might walk among them. The morning chatter in the high street was sharper than usual, voices lowered but eager. Mrs. Price Ridley was heard proclaiming that she had always distrusted visitors who kept to themselves, and Mrs. Hartnell insisted that if the police simply questioned every outsider, the matter would be resolved within a day. Miss Marple, seated in her garden beneath the climbing roses, smiled faintly at such optimism. She knew that murder was rarely so obliging. The police, for all their methods, had not yet uncovered what truly mattered: the motive. Without motive, the facts remained scattered, like pieces of embroidery cut from their pattern. It was mid-morning when Inspector Craddock called again, this time looking even more perplexed. "Miss Marple," he said without waiting to be invited in, "we've received confirmation from London. Edward Latham wasn't merely a businessman. He worked for a private import company, front, most likely, for something more delicate. There's suggestion of financial impropriety, perhaps even smuggling." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. Oh dear, smuggling! Such a vulgar occupation for a gentleman, though of course I imagine it attracts the same type of mind as parish politics: ambitious, secretive, and fond of loopholes. Craddock smiled wearily. He had associates. One of them is a name we've seen before: Henry Vale, or rather, Henry Valence. His record includes suspected fraud and blackmail, though nothing ever proved. Miss Marple set down her teacup. So Mr. Vale is not merely our mysterious lodger, but a man with practice in deception. Yet why would he risk returning here under a name so close to his own? Arrogance, perhaps, said Craddock, or desperation. He's still denying everything, of course. Claims he's never heard of Latham. Men of that type rarely deny convincingly, said Miss Marple. They protest too quickly, or too little. Did he look you in the eye when he said it? No, Craddock admitted. He was calm, too calm, as if he'd rehearsed the conversation before I'd even asked the question. Ah, said Miss Marple, the practised liar. It takes years to perfect that tone of mild indifference. But it always cracks somewhere, Inspector, if one knows where to press. Craddock leaned forward. And where would you press? On the smallest of details, she replied. A careless remark, an inconsistency of manners. It's human nature to betray oneself in the ordinary things. A man who lies about a murder may keep his composure, but ask him whether he takes sugar, and he'll hesitate. Craddock gave a dry laugh. If only we could solve cases over tea. Oh, but we can, said Miss Marple serenely. We simply need to serve it to the right people. Later that day, she decided to visit Mrs. Bantry, who had become the village's unofficial source of all things whispered and half-believed. Miss Marple's visits to Gossington Hall were always welcome. Mrs. Bantry adored a good mystery almost as much as she did a new hat. She greeted her friend with breathless excitement. Jane, you won't believe it. That's Mr. Vale. He was seen speaking to young Elsie, the maid at the vicarage behind the churchyard gate last night. My gardener swears it. Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her knitting paused mid-stitch. How curious! And what business could a gentleman have with a vicar's maid at such an hour? He said he was asking for directions, Mrs. Bantry said, clearly unconvinced. Direction? At 10 o'clock at night? Indeed, murmured Miss Marple. The kind of directions one gives when one is trying to find or hide something. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. You think she knows something? Perhaps. Or perhaps he believes she does. In my experience, the lower one's station, the more one overhears. Servants are repositories of truth, my dear, though most don't realize it. That evening, Miss Marple arranged to accidentally encounter Elsie on her walk home from the vicarage. The girl, rosy-cheeked and nervous, curtsied at once when she saw her. "Evening, Miss Marple." "Good evening, Elsie. I hear you've been of some help to our visitor at the Rose and Crown." The girl's eyes widened. "Oh, I didn't do nothing wrong, miss. He just asked if I'd seen anyone near the railway line that night. Said he was helping the police." "Helping," Miss Marple repeated softly. "And did you believe him?" "Well, he talked nice, polite-like, but I didn't much like how he kept looking over his shoulder, as if he thought someone was following." "Did he offer you anything, Elsie?" Miss Marple asked gently. The girl hesitated, then reached into her apron pocket, producing a folded piece of paper. "He gave me this, miss. Said if I saw anyone asking questions about him, I was to give it to the inspector. I didn't understand it, but I kept it safe." Miss Marple unfolded the note beneath the dim glow of the street lamp. The handwriting was neat but hurried. "If you're reading this, it's already too late. The man on the train wasn't meant to die. Look to the briefcase." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the final words. "The briefcase," she repeated quietly. "Did the inspector recover it?" "I don't think so, miss," Elsie said, frowning. "They said the dead man didn't have no luggage at all." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, folding the note carefully. "That's precisely what makes it so interesting." The following morning, she took the note directly to Inspector Craddock. He read it twice, his brow furrowing deeper each time. "We checked the compartment thoroughly," he said. "There was no briefcase." "Then it must have been removed before the body was discovered," Miss Marple said. "And that tells us something vital, that whoever took it either feared what it contained or desired it too much to leave behind." "You think Vale took it?" "Perhaps," she said thoughtfully, "but perhaps not. There's something about this that doesn't quite fit him. He strikes me as a man who manipulates others to act in his stead. It's a safer way to sin." Craddock leaned back. "If not him, then who?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window. "Someone close enough to the line to act quickly. Someone who knew the train had stopped. Perhaps the same shadow our young signalman saw stepping from the carriage." "We questioned everyone in that area," Craddock said. "All accounted for, all who admitted being there," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But lies of omission are the most polite kind, Inspector. In a small village, people lie not to deceive, but to preserve appearances. I dare say one of our good neighbours knows more than they've said." Craddock's expression grew grim. "You mean someone in St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Inspector, you seem surprised. Where better for guilt to hide than behind the reputation of respectability?" That night Miss Marple sat once again by her fire, the faint ticking of the clock marking the rhythm of her thoughts. The pieces were forming slowly, delicately. A man dead on a train, a missing ticket, a vanished briefcase, a note that spoke of an accident that was not meant to be. She knew from long experience that murder was rarely born of a single impulse. It was the end of a chain, each link forged by vanity, greed, or fear. Outside, the wind stirred the ivy against the window pane. Somewhere in the darkness, a train whistle sounded, long and low. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she listened. "Ah," she murmured to herself, "the next move has already begun." The morning broke with a fine drizzle that softened the outlines of the cottages and cast the village into a subdued hush. Miss Marple, wrapped in a grey shawl, sat by her kitchen table reading the day's newspaper, though her mind was far from its pages. Her thoughts circled the curious note and the missing briefcase. A death not meant to happen, the writer had said. That phrase alone had unsettled her. Murder by miscalculation, she knew, was often far more dangerous than one by design. It spoke of panic, of something gone wrong in a plan carefully made. The knock on her door came just after 9. It was Inspector Craddock again, looking tired and faintly irritable, as though the rain itself had worn his patience thin. "We've searched the area near the tracks," he said, shaking off his hat. "No sign of any briefcase. But there's been a development. The station master remembered something. A man came asking for a parcel to be held for collection. No name given, just a claim ticket. It was left the night of the murder." "And has it been collected?" Miss Marple asked. "Not yet," said Craddock. "We opened it this morning with authorization. Inside we found papers, ledgers, contracts, all signed by Edward Latham. And another name appears repeatedly, Henry Vallance." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. So our Mr. Vale and Mr. Latham were, in fact, partners. Yes, though what sort of partnership it was remains murky. There are references to shipments and accounts diverted. Nothing explicit, but it smells of fraud. "Criminal dealings often do," she said gently. "Did you find anything else?" Craddock hesitated, then took from his pocket a small object sealed in a plastic envelope. This was in the parcel too, a key, unmarked, old-fashioned sort, probably for a trunk or a case. Miss Marple examined it through the wrapping, her eyes thoughtful. "A key without its lock, Inspector. How like life itself, half the truth missing. But I dare say the other half isn't far." Craddock gave a faint, humourless laugh. "I wish you'd tell me where to look for it." "Oh, I imagine it's already close at hand," she said. "Murderers, like misplaced objects, are usually found precisely where one least expects them." After he had gone, Miss Marple sat in silence, the ticking of the clock marking the rhythm of her thoughts. A briefcase replaced by a parcel, a key without a lock, and a note claiming that the death had been unintended. It all pointed to a plan unravelling. She thought of Mr. Vale's calm facade, the furtive conversation overheard, and the curious meeting with Elsie. He was entangled, certainly, but perhaps not alone. If Latham had been blackmailing someone, perhaps one of his associates, then Vale's presence might signify fear rather than guilt. Yet fear and guilt often walked hand in hand. That afternoon Miss Marple took a quiet walk to the vicarage. The path was slick with rain, and the air carried the scent of wet earth and lilacs. Mrs. Clement received her warmly, though with that slightly distracted air that comes from having too many parish matters on one's mind. "I'm afraid the vicar is visiting a parishioner," she said. "But do come in, Miss Marple. I was just having a cup of tea." Miss Marple accepted the invitation with a smile. The sitting-room was filled with the comfortable clutter of books and embroidery. As they sat, she asked lightly, "I hear your maid has had quite the adventure lately, speaking to that gentleman at the inn." Mrs. Clement looked surprised. "Oh yes, Elsie mentioned it. I told her to be careful. One never knows with strangers. She said he was polite, but there was something about him she didn't like. I dare say she's not wrong. He's been seen walking toward the old mill several times since." "The old mill," Miss Marple repeated softly. "That's quite out of the way." "Indeed. Nobody's used it since the Blakes left years ago. It's falling to bits. What on earth he finds there, I can't imagine." "Solitude, perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. "Or concealment." She left soon after, but her mind was alert. The mill sat near the bend of the railway line, secluded, half hidden by reeds and willows, a perfect place for secrets. At dusk, she walked there alone, her pace unhurried but purposeful. The air was damp and heavy with the scent of moss. She could hear the distant rush of the river mingling with the faint metallic hum of the tracks. As she approached the broken doorway, she paused. Inside, the air smelled of rust and old wood. She stepped lightly, careful not to disturb the ground. There, half buried beneath a pile of discarded sacking, was something that caught the glint of her torchlight. A leather briefcase, scuffed but intact. She drew closer, her heart beating steadily. There was no lock, only a small brass plate with the initials EL. She did not open it, but noted the faint marks of damp fingers on the clasp. Recent ones. Someone had been here, perhaps within hours. Quietly, she replaced the sacking and withdrew, her shoes barely making a sound on the soft earth. When she returned home, Inspector Craddock was waiting at her gate, clearly having come straight from the station. "We've arrested Vale," he said grimly. "He tried to leave the village this evening. Took the 6:40 bus toward Marketbro. When we stopped him, he had a ticket to London and, interestingly enough, £200 in cash." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "That's a great deal of money for a man who came here for a country walk." "Exactly. He claims it was payment owed to him by Latham. He insists he's innocent. And do you believe him?" Craddock rubbed his temples. "I don't know. He's clever, that one. Cool as ice. But he looked shaken when I mentioned the missing briefcase." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "Then he didn't take it. You're certain?" "Quite. The guilty rarely react to the evidence they know exists, Inspector. Only to that which they thought was lost." Craddock stared at her, uncertain whether to be exasperated or impressed. "You're suggesting someone else retrieved it?" "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "And if I'm not mistaken, that someone will grow restless soon. Guilt is a heavy burden for the unpractised." That night Miss Marple did not sleep. She sat by her window, the curtains drawn back, her gaze fixed on the dim outline of the lane. Just after midnight, a movement caught her eye. A solitary figure walking quickly toward the road that led to the old mill. Small, slight, moving with anxious haste. Not a man's silhouette, but a woman's. Miss Marple rose at once, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. She did not follow. There was no need. She knew already that the next morning would bring a discovery, and with it a truth that had been edging closer with every clue. When dawn finally came, she received confirmation. A constable arrived breathless at her gate. "Miss Marple, we've found something down by the mill. The briefcase. Open, papers scattered. And there's blood on the handle." "Yes," said Miss Marple calmly. "I rather thought there would be." The young man blinked at her, startled. "You knew?" "One can always tell, my dear," she said gently. "When lies begin to fray, someone inevitably tries to tidy them, and makes the mess worse." As the constable hurried off to fetch the inspector, Miss Marple gazed out toward the distant line of the railway, the sunlight beginning to glint along the steel. The game, she thought, was reaching its middle stage. Not yet the end, but close enough for the shadow of truth to begin showing through. The killer had acted again, not with murder this time, but with fear. And fear, as she knew so well, was the most reliable of all confessions. Inspector Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage scarcely half an hour later, his face drawn with fatigue and curiosity in equal measure. The discovery at the mill had already stirred the village into a nervous hum. Even from her garden gate, Miss Marple could hear the faint echo of gossip spreading like ripples across still water. Craddock wasted no time. "You were right again," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "The briefcase was found exactly where you said. Papers torn, stained, scattered everywhere. But most curious of all, there were fingerprints. Not Vale's, a woman's." Miss Marple poured tea without looking up. "Ah, yes, I rather expected as much." "We've sent the prints to London," Craddock continued, "but I've already got a strong suspicion. The blood on the handle, it wasn't the victim's, it was fresh. Whoever tried to destroy those papers cut herself in haste." "Desperation seldom allows for tidiness," Miss Marple murmured. "And you believe it's someone local?" "Yes," Craddock said grimly. "The prints likely belong to one of the village women. I don't want to accuse anyone before I'm sure. But the sergeant swears he saw Mrs. Price Ridley near the lane last night, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Miss Marple looked up then, surprise flickering only briefly before composure returned. "Mrs. Price Ridley?" she repeated thoughtfully. "No, I don't think so. She'd faint at the sight of blood, and she's far too concerned with appearances to go traipsing through mud at midnight. But she would, I think, tell someone else to do it for her." "You mean she's involved?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple replied, "but she's a useful barometer for guilt. People of her temperament, judgmental, pious, easily shocked, often find themselves manipulated by those clever enough to appeal to their sense of virtue." "You suspect someone close to her?" Craddock asked. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the window. Perhaps her companion, Miss Weatherby. She has that curious mix of loyalty and fear that suggests dependency. The sort of woman who obeys even when her conscience protests. Craddock frowned. "But why would she destroy the papers?" "Because she was told it was the right thing to do," Miss Marple said quietly. "And people who crave approval rarely question the motives behind such requests." Craddock rubbed his chin. "We'll question her this afternoon. She's timid, though. I doubt she'll talk easily." "Then don't confront her," Miss Marple advised. "Let her feel safe. Guilt reveals itself best when it believes it's forgiven." After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat a while in thoughtful silence. She could picture the sequence of events now. The train stopping unexpectedly, someone seizing the chance to act, the briefcase taken and hidden, then panic when the body was discovered. The note, the blood, the attempt to erase evidence, it all spoke of someone out of their depth. Later that day, she went to the post office under the pretense of buying stamps. The place, as always, was abuzz with speculation. Mrs. Hartnell was there, clutching her handbag like a weapon. "Mark my words," she was saying loudly. "That man Vale brought wickedness with him. The devil follows strangers." Miss Weatherby, standing beside her, nodded nervously. "Yes, indeed, quite dreadful business. I only hope it's nearly over." Miss Marple joined them, offering a gentle smile. "Oh, I dare say these things do come to a close sooner or later, though sometimes, my dear Miss Weatherby, they end rather differently than we expect." Miss Weatherby turned pale. "Oh, what do you mean?" "Only that truth has a way of appearing when one least wishes it," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "A bit like mildew. It thrives in the dark." Mrs. Hartnell sniffed. "I only hope the police catch whoever's responsible. Between you and me, I've always said this village was too trusting. Mark my words, it starts with secret visitors and ends with scandal." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Oh, my dear, scandal has been with us since the Garden of Eden. We're simply better at hiding it now." Miss Weatherby gave a small, strained laugh, but her hands fidgeted with the clasp of her handbag. Miss Marple noticed a faint reddish mark along one of her fingers. Thin but fresh, not the sort of thing a woman would get from sewing or gardening. When Miss Marple left the post office, she walked slowly down the lane, thinking. By the time she reached her gate, she had made a decision. That evening she sent a small note to Miss Weatherby, inviting her for tea the next morning. Nothing serious, just a chat about the garden club meeting. The invitation was accepted at once. The next day dawned bright and clear, a rare interval of sunshine that made the air sparkle after so much rain. Miss Weatherby arrived promptly at 10, dressed neatly, but with eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. Miss Marple greeted her warmly and led her to the sitting-room, where tea was laid out with delicate precision. "Such lovely weather," Miss Marple began conversationally. "It does lift the spirits, doesn't it?" "Yes," Miss Weatherby said faintly, "though I confess I've been a little unsettled lately. All this business with the murder, it's most distressing." I can quite imagine, Miss Marple said kindly. One feels so helpless, doesn't one? Even when one wishes to do good, somehow things become muddled. Miss Weatherby's teacup trembled slightly. I only wanted to help, she said suddenly, her voice small. Mrs. Price Ridley said it was my Christian duty. She said that if I came across anything improper, I should make it right. I thought it was only papers. I didn't know. Oh, my dear, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Of course you didn't. None of us ever think how a small act might fit into something larger. You found the briefcase at the mill, didn't you? The woman's eyes filled with tears. I didn't steal it. I swear I didn't. Mrs. Price Ridley said a poor man had left it behind, and that it contained private letters. She told me to take it before anyone else did. I only wanted to return it quietly, but when I opened it, there was blood on it already. I was so frightened. Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost soothing. And so you tried to burn the papers? Miss Weatherby nodded miserably. I thought if I destroyed them, it would end the trouble. But I cut my hand trying to open the clasp. I didn't mean to do wrong, Miss Marple, truly. I believe you, Miss Marple said. But you see, my dear, someone took advantage of your good intentions. Someone who knew you'd obey without question. Mrs. Price Ridley? Miss Weatherby whispered. Or someone using her name, Miss Marple said. Either way, you were misled. When Miss Weatherby left, visibly relieved by the older woman's kindness, Miss Marple sat back in her chair and sighed. The pieces were tightening around a clearer pattern. The false instruction, the briefcase, the missing key, each element suggested manipulation. And behind manipulation always was control. That afternoon, Craddock returned to report that Miss Weatherby had confessed her role. She's frightened out of her wits, he said. Claims she was told to do it by an anonymous letter signed only a friend. The oldest trick in the book, said Miss Marple. A letter is such a convenient servant, it obeys without ever speaking back. So who sent it? Why, Inspector, I rather think we'll find our answer in handwriting, she said. But if I were you, I'd pay another visit to the station-master's brother, Mr. Pritchard. He's been most curious about this case from the start, hasn't he? And I've always found that those who know the timetable best are often the ones who rely upon it most carefully. Craddock blinked. You think Pritchard's involved? I think, Miss Marple said, smiling faintly, that he's been standing too close to the truth not to have noticed it. And those who notice too much often find it dangerous not to act. As Craddock departed to follow her suggestion, Miss Marple looked out over the village, the afternoon light slanting across the rooftops. The pattern was nearly whole now. Soon, very soon, the hidden thread would reveal the hand that wove it. And as always, it would be a hand driven not by hatred, but by something far more ordinary. Fear, greed, or pride, the three eternal companions of human folly. By the following morning, the tension in St. Mary Mead had grown taut as a drawn wire. The news of Miss Weatherby's confession had spread, though in a softened, half-accurate form. Villagers whispered that she had been caught hiding evidence for the murderer, while others swore she had burned a secret will. Miss Marple, hearing these rumours as she made her quiet rounds through the shops, noted how swiftly gossip distorted truth, yet how it sometimes circled close to it all the same. Human nature, she reflected, never truly lied. It merely embroidered. That afternoon, Inspector Craddock returned, boots muddy from the station yard, his face lined with a fatigue that spoke more of thought than labour. You were right about Pritchard, he said without preamble, stepping into Miss Marple's sitting room. He's admitted to handling one of Latham's letters, the same one that arranged the meeting on the train. Claims he found it by chance at the post office counter. And what did he do with it? Miss Marple asked, pouring tea. "Says he handed it over to his brother at the station, thinking it a misdelivery. But that's nonsense. The handwriting is small, sharp, foreign-looking. No local mistake, foreign-looking," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, narrow script, odd slant, almost continental. We compared it with Vale's writing. Doesn't match, which means another party was involved." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I never doubted that. Conspiracies, Inspector, are rather like jam. One never finds just a single ingredient." "We think the writer might have been one of Latham's associates in London," Craddock went on. "There's mention of a woman in the ledgers, name of Anna Despard, supposedly his secretary. She vanished 3 days before the murder." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "So our invisible hand may belong to a very visible woman." "We've alerted the London police," Craddock said. "But there's something else. The key we found, it fits a small chest stored at the station's luggage office. Pritchard's brother recognized it at once. Belonged to Latham. Inside were 2 items. A passport in Latham's name and a stack of currency. Pounds, francs, even a few American notes." "A man preparing to flee," Miss Marple observed. "Yes, but from whom? That's the question." Craddock's tone grew grim. "Vale swears he was trying to warn Latham, not kill him. Claims the whole affair was an attempt to cover up a smuggling ring gone wrong. Says he met the secretary once. Describes her as clever, calculating, and not easily frightened." "Women seldom are," said Miss Marple. "Not when they've had practice managing men." Craddock sighed. "You make it sound almost inevitable." "It often is," she replied. "When a clever woman finds herself tied to a foolish man, trouble follows like a shadow, and when money enters the picture, the shadow deepens." After he left, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting lying idle on her lap. The threads of the case were beginning to interlace. The false letter, the stolen briefcase, the vanished secretary. But one thread still refused to fit: the reaction of Henry Vale. His fear had seemed genuine, yet his calm had been studied. She could not help but wonder whether he was protecting someone rather than himself. The next morning brought further confirmation. A telegram arrived for Craddock, who immediately drove down to share its contents. "They've found her," he said barely through the door. "Anna Despard. She's in London, booked into a small boarding house under a false name. When they tried to arrest her, she bolted, took a train heading west." "West?" Miss Marple repeated, her tone even. "Toward us?" Craddock nodded. "Exactly. We've got men at the larger stations, but she could have slipped off anywhere along the line." "Then she'll come here," Miss Marple said quietly. "It's the one place she'll believe she can disappear into, among the ordinary and unsuspecting. There's safety in small places, Inspector. People don't ask questions in villages. They make assumptions." Craddock stared at her. "You really think she'd risk it?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that she's already here." That evening, the Rose and Crown was unusually lively for a weekday. A few travelling salesmen had arrived, bringing noise and drink into the usually subdued parlour. Miss Marple, sitting near the hearth with her embroidery, watched the door quietly. It opened at last, admitting a woman in a dark travelling coat, her hair tucked beneath a small hat, face pale but composed. She moved with purpose, but not haste, her eyes taking in the room's layout before she spoke to Mr. Hill at the counter. "A room, if you please, just for the night." Her voice carried a faint foreign cadence, soft but distinct. Miss Marple did not look up again, though she missed nothing. When the woman turned to take her key, their eyes met briefly. For a moment, something like recognition flickered in the stranger's gaze, then vanished as quickly as it came. Later, when the parlour had emptied and the inn quieted, Miss Marple approached Mr. Hill. "A curious visitor," she remarked mildly. "Does she remind you of anyone?" Mr. Hill rubbed his chin. "Now that you mention it, she looks a bit like the lady from the newspaper sketch. What was her name?" "Despard, that's it." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "Perhaps you should let Inspector Craddock know. Quietly, of course." Within the hour, Craddock arrived with 2 constables. They found the woman's room empty, the bed untouched, the window slightly ajar. She had slipped away again, leaving behind only a half-burned telegram in the grate. Craddock handed the scrap to Miss Marple the next morning. The message, though incomplete, was legible enough. "Train delay compromised. He suspects. Meet it. The rest was ash. She's clever," Craddock muttered. "Every step ahead of us." "Not clever enough," Miss Marple said, studying the paper. "This telegram, look at the phrasing. He suspects. That's not written by a woman afraid of discovery. It's written by one who still believes she's in control." Craddock frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning she's playing for something larger than escape," Miss Marple said. "If she's come here, it isn't to hide. It's to retrieve something or someone." The inspector blinked. Vale, of course. He's her unfinished business. Either he betrayed her, or she intends to finish what began on that train. "Then we'll keep him under guard," Craddock said firmly. "He's still at the station office." "Oh, I wouldn't do that," said Miss Marple softly. "A woman like Anna Despard doesn't walk into traps. She sets them." That night the station was quiet, except for the occasional whistle of the wind through the signal wires. Vale sat alone in the inspector's office, smoking nervously, eyes darting to the window. Outside, faint footsteps approached. Light, deliberate. The door creaked open. "Anna," he breathed. She closed the door behind her, calm as ever. "You shouldn't have come," he said, rising. "They're watching." "Not well enough," she replied coolly. "You always did underestimate me, Henry." "It was never meant to go that far," he said. "He wasn't supposed to die." "No," she said softly. "But he did. And now you'll fix it, won't you?" Miss Marple's voice broke the silence from the doorway. "I wouldn't count on that, my dear." Anna spun, startled, as Craddock stepped in behind her. For the first time her composure cracked. "How—" "A simple matter of human nature," Miss Marple said. "Guilt always revisits the scene of its making, especially when love and greed are both involved." Anna's eyes flashed. "You think you understand, but you don't." "Oh, on the contrary," said Miss Marple. "You planned a clever blackmail, but your partner grew frightened. You arranged the meeting on the train, meant only to frighten him into compliance. But panic turned to violence, and when it did, you vanished, leaving your accomplice to carry the blame." Vale's shoulders slumped. "I didn't mean to." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "Few ever do." As the constables led Anna away, Miss Marple stood by the window, gazing out toward the distant tracks gleaming under moonlight. The midnight train had carried not only a body, but a story of deceit, loyalty, and fear. A story, she thought, as old as human folly itself. When Craddock turned to thank her, she only smiled. "One sees these things, Inspector. After all, people are much the same everywhere, whether on a village lane or a midnight train. The next morning dawned pale and still, the kind of morning that seemed to hold its breath. Mist curled low over the hedgerows, and the village, after the night's excitement, had fallen into a tense quiet. Word of Anna Despard's arrest had spread, though only in fragments. Some said she was a foreign spy, others that she was a jilted lover. Miss Marple, hearing these embellishments as she took her customary walk to the grocer, merely smiled to herself. People, she reflected, preferred their scandals neatly wrapped, even if the truth was still unfolding like an unspooled thread. When Inspector Craddock arrived at her cottage that afternoon, he looked both triumphant and uneasy. "We've got her confession," he said without preamble, taking off his hat. At least part of it. She admits to being on the train that night, meeting Latham. Says Vale was supposed to bring her certain documents. Financial ledgers proving Latham was siphoning money from their company. She claims they only meant to frighten him into returning the funds. But when the train stopped near St. Mary Mead, everything went wrong. She insists it was Vale who struck the blow. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. And do you believe her? Craddock hesitated. It fits more or less. The note found in the victim's pocket, the missing briefcase, it all lines up. Vale had motive enough if he thought Latham might expose him. But not the temperament, Miss Marple murmured. Mr. Vale, for all his duplicity, has the nervous manner of a man who manipulates rather than murders. I doubt he could strike a killing blow without trembling so violently he'd drop the weapon. "He's no saint, Miss Marple," Craddock said. "He lied from the start." "Oh, certainly. But lying is a social skill, Inspector. Murder is an art of desperation. And desperation, in my experience, seldom looks as calm as Mr. Vale has appeared since his arrest." Craddock frowned. "You think she's still lying?" "Of course she's lying," Miss Marple said mildly. "But only about the part that matters. The truth, I suspect, lies in what she's not saying." "And what's that?" "Who she's protecting." The inspector gave her a bewildered look, but Miss Marple merely sipped her tea, eyes distant. When women like Miss Despard protect someone, it's rarely out of fear alone. She continued softly. It's out of something older. Loyalty or perhaps guilt twisted into love. She's not shielding herself, Inspector. She's shielding someone else. Craddock frowned deeper. Then who? Vale's the only one tied to her. "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "human knots are rarely tied so simply." That evening, Miss Marple received a visitor she had been expecting. Henry Vale, escorted by a constable but looking curiously at ease, had requested to see her before his formal questioning. Craddock, weary of the endless circles of interrogation, had agreed. Miss Marple greeted him as one might greet an errant nephew. "Mr. Vale," she said pleasantly, "you must be quite tired of policemen by now." "I've grown fond of their company," he said dryly. "They're persistent, but I thought perhaps a conversation with you might be more productive. You seem to see things they don't." "Not see," said Miss Marple. "Merely notice." He gave a faint smile, though his eyes were sharp. "Then notice this, Miss Marple. I didn't kill Latham. Anna did. She may tell you otherwise, but she's lying to save herself. She always does." "And yet," Miss Marple said, "you still came here, knowing she would be caught." "Why?" He stiffened. "What do you mean?" "You could have fled long before now," she said gently. "You had money, opportunity, and a head start. Yet you lingered. Men who linger after a crime do so for one reason only. They're waiting for something, or someone." Vale's composure faltered just slightly. "You think I wanted her caught?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "I think you wanted her safe, and that's rather different." He said nothing for a moment. Then, with a low sigh, he sank into the armchair opposite her. "You're perceptive, Miss Marple. Yes, I wanted to protect her. Not because she's innocent, but because she's foolish. She thought she could outsmart Latham, but she didn't understand him. He was never afraid of exposure. He thrived on it. He taunted her that night. Said he'd go to the police himself, make her an accomplice. She panicked. Struck him with the lamp from the compartment table. I arrived moments later. It was already done. And so you took the blame," Miss Marple said quietly, "out of love." He looked at her sharply, but the denial died before it formed. "I thought I could manage things," he said at last. "Hide the briefcase, keep her name clear, make it look like robbery gone wrong. But the train stopped, the timing failed, and everything unravelled." "It usually does," Miss Marple said gently. Human nature isn't designed for perfect crimes. She'd never survive prison, Vale said, voice roughened. She's clever, yes, but soft underneath. I thought if I took the fall, she could start over. And yet she came back, Miss Marple murmured, which means she never meant to let you do that. He looked up, startled. You think she returned for me? Oh, without question, but not for love, for control. You see, my dear Mr. Vale, people like Miss Despard can't bear to lose their narrative. You were meant to be her accomplice, her admirer, her pawn, but never her saviour. He stared at her, pale and silent. You don't understand, he said at last. A knock interrupted him. Inspector Craddock entered, his expression grave. Miss Marple, I'm afraid I need Mr. Vale back at the station. There's been a development. What sort of development? Miss Marple asked. Craddock hesitated. Anna Despard's dead. Suicide. Cyanide. She left a note, too short to explain much. Only one line. He was never meant to die. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Ah, she said softly. How very sad and very telling. Vale rose slowly, his face ashen. She didn't. No, she wouldn't. She did, Craddock said firmly. We found the vial in her cell. Miss Marple's gaze was distant, her voice quiet but steady. People often choose death not to escape justice, but to preserve their version of the truth. She wanted the story to end on her terms. Then it's finished, Craddock said, though without conviction. The case is closed. Miss Marple shook her head. Oh no, Inspector. Murder is never so tidy. You have a confession, a death, and a motive, yes, but not the truth. That still lies somewhere between what was planned and what was felt. You mean Vale's confession? Part of it, she said, but also something more subtle. Latham's death was the result of fear, yes, but not hers alone. There was another hand that night, unseen but decisive. Craddock frowned. Whose hand? Miss Marple looked at the dying embers in her hearth. Ah, that is what we must still find out. Because you see, Inspector, the dead seldom lie. It's the living who tell stories, and I believe someone in this village still has one to finish. As Vale was led away, Miss Marple remained seated by the fire, her face serene, but her mind keenly awake. Outside, a train whistled faintly across the fields, its sound carrying through the mist like an echo from the night of the murder. She watched the shadows flicker on the wall, knitting needles motionless in her lap. The game, she knew, was not yet over. Somewhere among the polite faces of St. Mary Mead, someone still held a secret, and she meant to see it uncovered, however gently it must be done. The evening that followed was still and strangely heavy, as though the village itself was holding its breath. The air hung low over the cottages, pressing down with a quiet unease that seemed to seep into every window. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, the lamplight soft on her knitting, though her hands moved more out of habit than purpose. Her mind, ever precise and untiring, traced and retraced the pattern of that fateful night. The train, the stop, the silence, and the death that was never meant to be. Anna Despard's final words lingered like a ghost. He was never meant to die. It was a confession, but also a riddle. People, Miss Marple reflected, rarely chose their last words without care. They left behind not facts, but fragments, shards of intention that hinted at the truth without ever quite revealing it. A knock sounded softly at the door. She knew before answering that it would be Inspector Craddock. His tread was always brisk but careful, as if he disliked disturbing even the gravel. He entered, removing his hat. "Forgive the late hour, Miss Marple," he began, "but I'm troubled. There's something about this case that refuses to sit right. We've the confession, the suicide, the papers, and yet—" And yet the picture doesn't quite match the frame, Miss Marple said gently, setting her knitting aside. Precisely, he sat down heavily. I went through Latham's effects again this afternoon. Among the papers was a train ticket, not his own, mind you, but another man's. It was hidden inside the lining of his coat. The name on it was Mr. Harold Pritchard. Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. The station-master's brother, the same. It makes no sense. Why would Latham have his ticket? Unless, Miss Marple said softly, he didn't take it. He was given it. Craddock frowned. You mean as part of the plan? Possibly. Mr. Pritchard was a small man with large ambitions. Ambitions that the confines of a country station could never satisfy. He would have found a man like Latham quite inspiring, shall we say. Craddock leaned forward. You think Pritchard was part of the smuggling operation? Oh, I'm certain he was, said Miss Marple. But that's not what concerns me. What interests me is motive. Latham's death benefited no one, except perhaps the one who feared exposure the most. You think Pritchard killed him? Craddock said slowly. But why? Because, Miss Marple replied, he panicked. The express stopped near St. Mary Mead that night, remember? Quite by chance, or so it seemed. But I suspect it wasn't chance at all. The signalman's wiring fault. Very convenient, wouldn't you say? It allowed just enough time for someone local, someone who knew the line, to approach the train unseen. Craddock's eyes widened. You're suggesting Pritchard engineered the stop? Yes. Perhaps he meant only to retrieve something from Latham. A document, a payment, perhaps the very briefcase we've all been chasing. But something went wrong. There was a struggle, a blow, panic. When the train moved again, it carried a corpse instead of a conspirator. Craddock rubbed his temples. And Anna Despard Vale. Pawns, Miss Marple said gently. Useful distractions. Miss Despard may have believed herself in control, but she was being used. Pritchard was cleverer than anyone realized. He let them play their game while ensuring the real danger, his own involvement, remained hidden. Then why come forward with that letter? Why admit to touching it? To appear helpful, said Miss Marple. He knew suspicion would pass over him precisely because he seemed so eager to assist. It's an old trick, Inspector. I've seen it used often in the Women's Institute Committee. Those who volunteer to tidy the minutes are usually the ones who wish to alter them. Craddock gave a tired smile. You make it sound almost civilized. Murder often is, Miss Marple said quietly, until it isn't. She rose, walked to her window, and peered out at the faint glimmer of the station lights in the distance. You'll find him there, I think. He'll be restless tonight. Guilt often drives people back to the scene of their control. They like to reassure themselves that order still exists. Craddock hesitated. You mean he might try to run? No, Miss Marple said, her gaze steady. He'll try to fix it. A man like that always does. He can't abide loose ends. The inspector left at once, promising to return, though Miss Marple knew he wouldn't need to. Some truths had a way of declaring themselves without assistance. She sat back in her chair and waited, the house quiet save for the faint ticking of the clock. Outside the fog was thickening again, curling low around the hedges like smoke. Hours passed before the expected sound came. A far-off commotion near the station, the sharp cry of a whistle, then silence. It was nearly dawn when Craddock returned. His coat was damp, his eyes weary but resolute. You were right, he said, his voice low. We found Pritchard, dead. Miss Marple's expression did not change. How? Suicide by all appearances. He left a note in the signal box. Confessed to it all, sabotaging the signal, meeting Latham, the blow to the head. Said it was an accident, but he couldn't live with what followed. And the money? Gone, Craddock said grimly. Whatever he took from that briefcase, it wasn't found. Perhaps hidden, perhaps destroyed. Miss Marple sighed softly. A pity, but perhaps justice has its own ways. Some truths are best buried, if only because the living have already paid for them. Then it's over, Craddock said, though his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Miss Marple asked gently. You'll recall, Inspector, that Anna Despard said he was never meant to die. She was right. Latham's death was not planned. It was a collision of greed and fear. Pritchard's blow was impulsive, not murderous, and yet the chain it set in motion destroyed 3 lives. Craddock sat in silence. You make it sound almost tragic. Oh, but it is, Miss Marple said. Murder nearly always is. People imagine it begins with hatred, but it doesn't. It begins with the smallest of selfish acts, a lie, a theft, a betrayal, and grows from there until it consumes everything. The room was very still. At last, Craddock rose, placing his hat back on his head. I don't know how you do it, Miss Marple. You make the worst of humanity sound almost inevitable. It is inevitable, she said, smiling faintly, because it's simply human nature. And that, Inspector, is the one mystery that never changes. When he had gone, Miss Marple remained by the window until the first blush of sunrise touched the fields. A train whistled faintly in the distance. The morning express, punctual and serene, as though the events of the past days were no more than a whisper in the wind. She thought of Latham, of Vale, of Anna Despard, of Pritchard, all caught in the web of their own design. Life, she mused, was a series of stations and departures, each one determined by choices made in haste and regret. Picking up her knitting again, she smiled quietly to herself. The village would gossip for weeks, perhaps months, but soon the story would fade into one more whispered memory of tragedy and intrigue. And life, as it always did, would go on. Tea would be poured, gardens tended, and trains would keep their schedule. Yet somewhere in the faint echo of the rails, she thought she could still hear the midnight train's mournful cry, a reminder that beneath the calm surface of even the most peaceful village, the darkness of human folly always waited, patient and watchful. The morning after Pritchard's death was crisp and quiet, the kind of morning that seemed almost to insist upon normalcy. Birds sang as though to drown out the whispers that still drifted through St. Mary Mead. Yet beneath the soft hum of daily life, the village carried the uneasy aftertaste of tragedy. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley declared that it was all perfectly dreadful, and that she'd always known something was odd about that Pritchard man. Mrs. Hartnell insisted it was the wages of sin and quite possibly connected to foreign influences. But by the time Miss Marple stepped out to fetch her post, the story was already acquiring the faint varnish of legend, a tale to be retold at church teas for years to come. She listened to it all with polite interest, but her eyes were distant, thoughtful. It was over, or so everyone believed. Yet Miss Marple felt the subtle dissonance that comes when a melody has not truly resolved. Some part of the truth was still missing, something faint but persistent, like a note slightly off-key. When Inspector Craddock called that afternoon, his expression confirmed her feeling. "I shouldn't be here," he said as she poured tea. "The case is closed, but something won't leave me alone." I went over Pritchard's letter again. It's detailed, too detailed. He names times, places, everything. But it reads like someone describing a story they've been told, not one they've lived. "Oh?" Miss Marple asked gently. "You noticed that too?" Craddock frowned. "You mean you think someone else wrote it?" "Perhaps not entirely," she said. "But there's a rhythm to guilt, Inspector. Real guilt stumbles. It hesitates, contradicts itself. Pritchard's letter is almost elegant. Too neat, too deliberate. It lacks the trembling edges of truth. Then who wrote it? Ah, Miss Marple said softly. That is the question, isn't it? Who benefits from a dead man's confession? Craddock leaned back, rubbing his chin. Vale's free now. His alibi holds. Anna's gone. Pritchard's dead. No one else had anything to gain. Except, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling faintly, the one person clever enough to understand that murder can be disguised as justice. You don't mean? Oh, I mean precisely that, Miss Marple said. Someone used Pritchard's guilt and fear to end the story neatly. A suicide is a convenient closure, but it's also a silent one. No one asks further questions of the dead. But who would go to such trouble? Someone whose position depended upon peace returning quickly. Someone for whom scandal would be inconvenient. Someone, perhaps, with access to official evidence and the ability to forge a letter in another man's hand. Craddock's face darkened. Good Lord, you can't mean Hill? The station master? Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. I believe our Mr. Hill has been playing conductor to this entire dreadful symphony. She watched the inspector carefully as she spoke. He knew the train schedules, the personnel, and the gossip. He would have known Pritchard's anxieties, his weaknesses. It wouldn't have been difficult to manipulate him, nor to ensure his death looked like despair rather than silence enforced. But why? Craddock demanded. What would Hill gain? Survival, Miss Marple said simply. Hill was involved from the beginning, not in the killing, but in what preceded it, the smuggling. He was the one who ensured the shipments passed without inspection, who profited quietly from both Latham and Pritchard. When Latham died, Hill's empire of secrets began to crumble. He needed an ending that would seal every mouth. Anna dead, Vale disgraced, Pritchard gone, and the village none the wiser. Craddock rose, pacing the small parlour. If you're right, it's monstrous. Monstrous, Miss Marple agreed softly, but very tidy. And tidy people, in my experience, are far more dangerous than untidy ones. They clean up not just messes, but evidence. He stopped pacing, a grim determination settling over him. Then we'll search the station-master's office. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. But do it quietly, Inspector. Mr. Hill is a careful man. He'll have already prepared an explanation for every loose end. What he won't expect is that someone might look beneath the obvious. That evening, Craddock did precisely that. While Hill was away attending to an inspection, the inspector and his men combed through the small office by lamplight. Papers, ledgers, schedules, all appeared in perfect order, each entry in Hill's neat hand. But behind a loose panel beneath the desk, they found a small tin box. Inside were several bundles of notes, English and foreign currency, and a single folded letter bearing Latham's signature. It was a receipt, dated the day before the murder, acknowledging a final payment for services rendered. Craddock stared at it for a long time. He's been buying silence, he murmured. Or selling it, said Miss Marple from the doorway, for she had come quietly, knowing the night would lead them here. Her eyes lingered on the letter. He must have realized Latham intended to escape, and that frightened him. He couldn't allow one conspirator to vanish while the other remained. Too many questions, too much risk. Then Pritchard's death? Arranged, she said softly, not by violence but by persuasion. A forged letter perhaps slipped under his door. A few whispered words. Guilt is a dreadful poison, Inspector. It doesn't need much encouragement to do its work. Craddock closed the box and exhaled slowly. We'll arrest him tonight. Yes, said Miss Marple, but take care. He's the kind of man who would rather destroy himself than be exposed. Her warning proved prophetic. When they reached Hill's cottage at the edge of the village, the lamp was still burning in the front window, but there was no answer to the knock. The door was unlocked. Inside, they found him at his desk, slumped forward, an overturned cup beside him, and a faint smell of bitter almonds in the air. On the desk lay a short note, written in his precise script. "The train has reached its final stop. Let it rest." Craddock stood in silence for a long time. "Cyanide again," he said at last. "He must have kept a supply." Miss Marple looked down at the dead man, her expression grave but not unkind. "They so often do," she said. "Men like him think of everything except mercy." It was nearly dawn by the time they left. The fog had lifted, and the first streaks of sunlight were spreading across the fields, pale and new. As they reached the lane, Craddock turned to her. "You were right from the start, you know." "Oh, not entirely," Miss Marple said with a faint smile, "and I merely followed the nature of things. Once one sees how people behave, one can almost predict the rest." "And what lesson do you take from this one?" he asked quietly. "That deceit is like a timetable, Inspector," she said. "Once set in motion, it carries everyone along, whether they mean to travel or not." He nodded slowly, and for a moment neither spoke. The village lay ahead, calm and unsuspecting once more, its chimneys sending thin plumes of smoke into the morning air. Life would resume its rhythm. The post delivered, the market opened, the gossip renewed. The tragedy would become a story, the story a memory, and the memory a warning that few would heed. Miss Marple returned to her cottage just as the church clock struck 8. She made herself tea, added 1 cube of sugar, and sat by the window where the light fell kindly upon her knitting. Outside, she could hear the distant whistle of the morning express, steady and punctual. It was as though nothing at all had happened. No death, no deceit, no midnight train echoing through the fog. Yet in her mind, she could still see the glimmer of the rails stretching into the horizon, a quiet reminder of the fragile order of the world. Evil, she reflected, was rarely loud or dramatic. It crept quietly like smoke through the cracks until someone noticed the scent. And that, she thought with a small tired smile, was why one must always keep one's windows open and one's eyes sharper still. The days that followed brought a gentle quiet back to St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself had decided to smooth over the disturbances of human folly with the balm of routine. The newspapers spoke of the midnight train murder mystery, with the detached fascination of those safely removed from it, their columns filled with speculation and tidy conclusions. To the wider world, the case was closed. 3 dead, 1 freed, and a small village returned to peace. But Miss Marple knew that true endings were seldom so neat. The echoes of wrongdoing lingered long after justice had been declared. Life resumed its rhythm. Mrs. Bantry once again hosted her teas. Mrs. Price Ridley found moral satisfaction in recounting her suspicions, and the vicar's wife quietly thanked heaven that all had concluded without scandal to the parish. The trains ran on time again, their whistles softer, less ominous. Yet to Miss Marple, every sound of a passing locomotive still carried a whisper of that night. The cold stop near the bridge, the quiet blow that changed so many lives, and the chain of small deceits that had begun long before the murder itself. One evening, about a week after the final inquest, Inspector Craddock came to see her once more. His manner was less official now. There was something almost companionable in his fatigue. "I thought I'd pay my respects, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat as he stepped into her cosy sitting room. "The files are all in order. The commissioner's pleased. The press will have their story. And yet, for all that, I feel oddly dissatisfied, as though I've missed something." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That's because you're human, Inspector. We all dislike stories that end too perfectly. They feel unnatural. He chuckled. "You may be right. Still, I can't help but wonder if we truly found the whole truth. Hill's confession ties the case together, but it feels rehearsed, she finished softly. Yes, I dare say it was. Hill was a man who prized symmetry. He could not bear to leave a crooked picture on a wall. Even in death, he sought to tidy what could never truly be put right. Craddock sank into the armchair opposite her, gazing absently at the glowing hearth. 3 deaths, all linked by greed and fear. And yet none of them monsters, were they? Just ordinary people. Oh, indeed, Miss Marple said gently. Monsters are rare, Inspector. But the ordinary, they can be dreadfully dangerous when frightened. Fear is the seed from which most wickedness grows. A little dishonesty, a little pride, a touch of cowardice, and soon you have tragedy. He nodded slowly, watching the firelight flicker. I sometimes wonder what might have happened if that train hadn't stopped. It would have happened all the same, said Miss Marple. The place may change, the hour may differ, but once human passions are set in motion, they will find their moment. The train was only a stage, not the play itself. There was a silence then, companionable and reflective. Outside, the evening mist had begun to gather again, softening the outlines of the hedgerows. A faint whistle drifted through the quiet, distant but familiar. Craddock looked up at the sound. "She still runs on time, then," he said, half to himself. Miss Marple's eyes followed the direction of the sound. "Yes," she murmured, "the world must go on, you see, even when it carries our sorrows with it." Craddock rose, pulling on his gloves. "Well, Miss Marple, I hope this is the last time we meet over something so grim," she smiled. "Oh, my dear Inspector, I rather think human nature won't allow that." He laughed softly and took his leave, his figure soon disappearing into the mist. When the door had closed, Miss Marple sat for a while longer by the window, her knitting idle in her lap. She thought of Vale, free now, but forever burdened by the memory of what he had failed to prevent, of Anna Despard, brilliant, foolish, and undone by her own pride, of Pritchard and Hill, men caught in the machinery of their own making. Each had been drawn to deceit for reasons they thought justified, and each had paid the price demanded by truth. In the end, Miss Marple reflected, the crime had not been about smuggling or blackmail or even murder. It had been about human weakness, the same quiet, unremarkable weakness she had seen all her life in parishes, committees, and drawing-rooms. People were much alike everywhere, whether in a London train or a country village. They deceived out of fear, they hurt out of desperation, and they lied most often to themselves. She rose, drew the curtains, and tidied the teacups on her tray. Outside, the wind stirred the ivy against the window pane, a soft rustle that might almost have been the sigh of the night itself. From far away came the long, low call of another passing train, gliding through the darkness towards destinations unknown. Miss Marple paused, listening, her expression unreadable but calm. "Yes," she murmured at last, almost to herself, "there will always be another train, another journey, another secret carried quietly through the night." And with that, she extinguished the lamp, leaving the room bathed in moonlight, her silhouette framed against the window, a small, still figure in a vast, intricate world, forever watching, forever understanding. The clock struck 10. The house settled into silence, and somewhere beyond the fields, the midnight train wailed once more, before fading into the distance, as if bidding farewell to a mystery now laid to rest.